In the vast stretches of the Nubian Desert, where the Nile carves its ancient path through golden sands and time itself seems to stand still, there once thrived a civilization so powerful, so magnificent, that it challenged the very might of Egypt. This was the Kingdom of Kush, a name that once echoed through the corridors of power across the ancient world, a realm whose pharaohs wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, whose armies struck fear into the hearts of empires, and whose wealth flowed like the great river that gave it life. Yet today, in the classrooms of the world, in the museums that claim to tell humanity's story, Kush remains a whisper, a footnote, a kingdom deliberately erased from the grand narrative of civilization. This is the story of Africa's forgotten empire, a tale of power and conquest, of culture and resilience, of a people who built pyramids that still stand as silent witnesses to their greatness, and of a legacy that refuses to die despite centuries of erasure. Long before Rome was founded, before Greece reached its golden age, before the great libraries of Alexandria held the world's knowledge, the Kingdom of Kush was already ancient. Its roots stretched back into the mists of prehistory, to a time when the Sahara was green and rivers flowed where now only sand remains. The land that would become Kush, known to its people as the Kingdom of Kerma in its earliest incarnation, emerged around 2500 BCE in the region of Nubia, that fertile corridor stretching along the Nile south of Egypt's traditional borders. Here, at the crossroads between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean world, a distinct civilization began to take shape, one that would rival and eventually conquer its powerful northern neighbor. The geography that cradled Kush was both blessing and crucible. The Nile's cataracts, those dramatic rapids and waterfalls that punctuated the river's northward flow, created natural boundaries that protected Nubia from easy invasion while facilitating trade and communication. Between the first and sixth cataracts, the Kushites built their kingdom on the rich alluvial soil, deposited by annual floods, cultivating grain and raising cattle in an environment that, while harsher than Egypt's Nile Delta, was nonetheless capable of sustaining a sophisticated society. But it was not agriculture alone that built Kush's wealth. The kingdom sat astride one of the ancient world's most valuable trade routes, the corridor connecting the heart of Africa with the Mediterranean civilizations of the north. Through Kushite territory flowed gold from the mines of Nubia, ivory from the elephants of the interior, ebony and exotic woods, incense and precious stones, enslaved peoples captured in raids to the south, and most critically, iron. The relationship between Kush and Egypt began not as one of equals, but as a complex dance of trade, tribute, and tension. Egypt, that ancient civilization whose monuments still captivate the world's imagination, viewed Nubia with a mixture of desire and disdain. The Egyptians called the land Tasseti, the land of the bow, acknowledging the fearsome skill of Nubian archers whose composite bows and deadly accuracy made them sought-after mercenaries and feared enemies. Egyptian pharaohs of the Old and Middle Kingdoms launched repeated campaigns into Nubia, seeking to control the gold mines and trade routes, establishing fortresses along the Nile to extract tribute and maintain dominance. Egyptian texts from this period drip with contempt, referring to Nubians as vile and wretched, the typical language of empire used to justify subjugation and exploitation. But the Nubians were far from the primitive peoples Egyptian propaganda portrayed. The Kingdom of Kerma, Kush's predecessor state, developed its own distinct material culture, its own artistic traditions, and its own political structures. Kerma's potters created some of the finest ceramics of the ancient world, thin-walled vessels of remarkable beauty with distinctive black-topped red surfaces. Kerma's rulers built massive mud brick structures called diffufas, temple tombs that still stand today as testament to their architectural ambition. And Kerma's warriors proved more than capable of defending their homeland and even striking back at Egyptian power. When Egypt fell into the chaos of the Second Intermediate Period around 1650 BCE, weakened by internal strife and the invasion of the Hyksos from the north, the Kingdom of Kerma expanded northward, occupying Egyptian territory and reclaiming lands long held by the pharaohs. Egypt's eventual resurgence under the new kingdom brought renewed pressure on Nubia. Pharaohs like Thutmose I and Thutmose III pushed south with overwhelming force, conquering Kerma and establishing direct Egyptian rule over Nubia for nearly 5 centuries. This period of Egyptian dominance, from roughly 1500 to 1070 BCE, might have spelled the end of Nubian independence. Egyptian culture flooded into Nubia. Egyptian gods were worshipped in newly built temples. Egyptian language and writing systems were adopted by Nubian elites. The sons of Nubian chiefs were taken to Egypt to be educated in Egyptian ways, a common imperial strategy designed to create a compliant ruling class. Yet something remarkable happened during these centuries of occupation. Rather than being culturally erased, the Nubians absorbed, adapted, and synthesized. They learned Egyptian statecraft and military organization. They adopted Egyptian religious practices, but maintained their own spiritual traditions. They became, in effect, master students of the civilization that sought to dominate them, learning lessons they would soon turn back upon their former masters. The collapse of the new kingdom ushered in Egypt's third intermediate period, an era of fragmentation and weakness that began around 1070 BCE. As Egyptian power waned, as the pharaohs' grip on their southern territories loosened, a new Kushite state emerged in the region around Napata, near the Fourth Cataract. This new Kingdom of Kush, sometimes called the Napatan Kingdom, to distinguish it from its Kerma predecessor, rose in the power vacuum left by Egyptian withdrawal. Its early rulers, whose names are lost to history or recorded only in fragments, began the process of consolidating power, unifying the Nubian tribes, and building the economic and military foundations that would support an empire. By the 8th century BCE, Kush had grown strong enough to look northward with ambition rather than fear. The man who would transform Kush from regional power to imperial force was Kashta, whose name means the Kushite. Taking the throne around 760 BCE, Kashta was not content with independence alone. He understood that Egypt, despite its current weakness, remained the ancient world's most prestigious civilization, a land whose religious legitimacy and cultural authority commanded respect across the known world. Kashta began pushing into Upper Egypt, the southern portion of the Egyptian realm, not as a conqueror seeking plunder, but as a claimant to legitimate authority. He adopted Egyptian royal titles. He had himself depicted in traditional pharaonic regalia. Most significantly, he arranged for his daughter Amenirtis to become the god's wife of Amun at Thebes, one of the most powerful religious positions in Egypt, effectively inserting Kushite royal authority into the heart of Egyptian religious establishment. But it was Kashta's son, Piye, who would achieve what no African ruler had accomplished before, the conquest and unification of all Egypt under Kushite rule. Piye ascended the Kushite throne around 747 BCE, inheriting his father's ambitions and possessing the military genius to realize them. Egypt at this time was fractured into rival kingdoms and princedoms, with competing dynasties claiming legitimacy. The Delta region in the north was divided among several petty kings. The city of Hermopolis was ruled by its own prince. Thebes acknowledged Kushite influence, but maintained autonomy. Into this chaotic landscape came Tefnacht, the powerful ruler of Sais in the western delta, who began a campaign to unite Egypt under his rule, pushing southward and threatening the Kushite sphere of influence. Piye's response was swift and overwhelming. Around 728 BCE, he marched north from Napata at the head of a formidable army, a force that combined the traditional strength of Nubian archery with Egyptian-style infantry and cavalry tactics learned during centuries of interaction. Piye's campaign is documented in one of ancient history's most detailed military records, a massive granite stela erected at his temple in Gebel Barkal. This victory stela of Piye provides a year-by-year account of the campaign, revealing not just military movements but also Piye's character and motivations. What emerges is a portrait of a ruler who saw himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a legitimate Egyptian pharaoh fulfilling his divine duty to restore order, what the Egyptians called Ma'at, to a fractured land. Piye's army swept through Upper Egypt, accepting the submission of local rulers who recognized his authority. When he reached Thebes, he performed the proper religious rituals at the Temple of Amun, demonstrating his piety and legitimacy. But when Hermopolis refused to submit, Piye laid siege to the city with ruthless efficiency. His stela describes the siege in vivid detail. Walls surrounded, supplies cut off, the city's inhabitants reduced to desperation. When Hermopolis finally surrendered, Piye entered the city not in vengeful destruction, but in triumph, accepting the submission of its ruler and securing the city's allegiance. City after city fell or submitted as Piye's army advanced northward. Memphis, Egypt's ancient capital, resisted and was taken by assault, Piye's forces storming the walls and overwhelming the defenders. Tefnacht himself, seeing his coalition crumbling, eventually submitted to Piye's authority, though he avoided personal surrender by sending emissaries instead. By the time Piye returned to Napata in triumph, he had achieved something unprecedented. He had united all of Egypt under his rule. He had been crowned with the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. He had performed the traditional rituals at Egypt's most sacred sites. He was, by every measure that mattered in the ancient world, Pharaoh of Egypt. Yet remarkably, Piye chose to return to Kush rather than remain in Egypt to rule directly from Memphis or Thebes. This decision has puzzled historians for generations. Some suggest he found Egypt's politics too fractious, preferring to rule from his Nubian heartland. Others argue he viewed his campaign as primarily a mission of religious restoration rather than permanent conquest. Whatever his reasoning, Piye's return to Napata allowed the Egyptian princelings he had defeated to gradually reassert their independence, setting the stage for his successors to reimpose Kushite authority. Piye's brother Shabaka, who succeeded him around 712 BCE, took a different approach. Where Piye had been content to campaign and return home, Shabaka understood that controlling Egypt required permanent presence. He marched north, defeated the resurgent Tefnacht's son Bakanrinef, and established direct Kushite rule over Egypt, relocating the capital to Memphis and initiating what Egyptologists call the 25th dynasty. Under Shabaka and his successors, Kush and Egypt were not separate kingdoms, but a unified empire, stretching from the Mediterranean to the heart of Africa, from the Delta to the Sixth Cataract, the largest territorial extent Egypt had known in centuries. The 25th dynasty pharaohs were not foreign occupiers ruling through force alone. They were deeply committed to Egyptian culture and tradition, perhaps more so than many native Egyptian dynasties that had preceded them. They undertook massive building projects, constructing and restoring temples throughout Egypt. They sponsored a renaissance of Egyptian art and culture, looking back to the glorious Old Kingdom for inspiration and reviving artistic styles that had fallen into neglect. They patronized scribes and scholars, collected ancient texts, and promoted the worship of traditional Egyptian gods, particularly Amun, whom they had long venerated in their Nubian homeland. In many ways, the Kushite pharaohs were more Egyptian than the Egyptians themselves, zealous converts who had adopted their former masters' civilization with the fervor of true believers. Yet they remained distinctly African in ways that Egyptian art and texts cannot completely obscure. The Kushite pharaohs had themselves depicted with clear African features, their statues and reliefs showing them with the physical characteristics of their Nubian heritage. They maintained the Kushite tradition of powerful queen mothers, women who held real political authority in ways that had no parallel in traditional Egyptian practice. They continued to build and worship at Napatan temples even while ruling from Memphis. They were, in essence, creating a new synthesis, a culture that was simultaneously Kushite and Egyptian, African and Mediterranean, forging an identity that transcended the narrow boundaries of ethnicity and geography. The reign of Taharqa, who became pharaoh around 690 BCE, represented the 25th dynasty at its zenith. Taharqa was perhaps the greatest of the Kushite pharaohs, a ruler whose name appears not only in Egyptian monuments but also in the Hebrew Bible, where he is mentioned as a potential ally against Assyrian aggression. Taharqa's reign was marked by ambitious building projects throughout his empire. He constructed massive additions to the Temple of Amun at Karnak, including the famous colonnade that still stands today. He built extensively at Napata and other Kushite cities. He commissioned monuments from Memphis to Meroe, each one proclaiming his power and piety. Under Taharqa, the Kushite Empire reached its cultural and political peak, a realm that combined the wealth of Nubia's gold mines, the agricultural productivity of Egypt's Nile Valley, and the trading networks that connected Africa to the wider ancient world. But Taharqa's reign also brought the empire into direct conflict with the superpower of the age, Assyria. The Assyrian Empire, based in Mesopotamia, was the ancient world's most formidable military machine, an empire built on iron weapons, siege warfare, and a ruthless efficiency that made it the terror of its age. Assyria had been expanding westward, conquering the Levant and threatening Egypt's traditional sphere of influence. The cities of Palestine and Syria, including the Kingdom of Judah, found themselves caught between these two great powers, seeking allies wherever they could find them. Taharqa, seeing both threat and opportunity, involved himself in the politics of the Levant, supporting resistance to Assyrian expansion and positioning Kush as a counterweight to Assyrian power. The collision was inevitable. In 701 BCE, the Assyrian king Sennacherib launched a campaign against Judah, besieging Jerusalem and threatening to add it to his growing empire. Taharqa, who was still a prince commanding the Egyptian army at the time, marched north to confront the Assyrians. What happened next is recorded in both Assyrian annals and the Hebrew Bible, though the accounts differ dramatically in their details. The Assyrian records claim victory, describing how Sennacherib defeated the Egyptian and Kushite forces. The biblical account in 2 Kings describes a miraculous deliverance, with an angel of the Lord striking down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in a single night, forcing Sennacherib to withdraw. Modern historians debate what actually occurred, with theories ranging from plague in the Assyrian camp to a military stalemate that both sides claimed as victory. What is certain is that Jerusalem was not conquered, Sennacherib returned to Assyria, and Taharqa's reputation was enhanced. But the Assyrian threat did not end with Sennacherib. His successors, particularly Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, were determined to conquer Egypt and end Kushite power once and for all. Esarhaddon invaded Egypt in 674 BCE, but was initially repulsed by Taharqa's forces. The Kushite pharaoh had learned from the earlier conflicts, strengthening Egypt's defenses and organizing its military along more efficient lines. But Assyrian persistence proved overwhelming. In 671 BCE, Esarhaddon returned with a larger army, breaking through Egyptian defenses and driving deep into the delta. Memphis fell to the Assyrians. Taharqa was forced to flee south to Thebes. Esarhaddon proclaimed himself Pharaoh of Egypt, installed puppet rulers in the delta, and claimed total victory. The Assyrian king's inscriptions boast of his conquest in vivid language, describing how he defeated Taharqa and brought Egypt under Assyrian dominion. Yet Taharqa refused to accept defeat. As soon as the Assyrian army withdrew to deal with other threats to their far-flung empire, the Kushite pharaoh counterattacked, sweeping north from Thebes and retaking Memphis. The puppet rulers Esarhaddon had installed either fled or submitted to restored Kushite authority. For a brief moment, it seemed Taharqa had salvaged his empire. But the Assyrians were not finished. Ashurbanipal, who succeeded his father Esarhaddon in 669 BCE, launched another massive invasion in 667 BCE. This time the Assyrian assault was even more devastating. Ashurbanipal's armies not only retook Memphis, but pushed south to Thebes itself, Egypt's religious heart and the center of Kushite power in Egypt. In 663 BCE, Assyrian forces sacked Thebes, an act of destruction so catastrophic that it was remembered for generations. The prophet Nahum, writing decades later, would reference the fall of Thebes as an example of how even the mightiest cities could be brought low. The sack of Thebes marked the effective end of Kushite rule in Egypt. Taharqa retreated to Napata, where he died in 664 BCE. His successor and nephew, Tantamani, made one final attempt to retake Egypt, briefly recapturing Memphis in 664 BCE, but Ashurbanipal's response was swift and final. The Assyrians drove Tantamani back into Nubia and installed Psamtik I, a native Egyptian from Sais, as pharaoh of a reunified Egypt. The 25th dynasty was over. After less than a century of ruling Egypt, the Kushite pharaohs had been expelled, their empire broken, their dreams of permanent union between Kush and Egypt shattered by Assyrian iron and military might. For many civilizations, such a defeat would have spelled the end. But Kush was not destroyed, it was transformed. Retreating to their Nubian heartland, the Kushite rulers might have sunk into obscurity, becoming just another footnote in the long history of peoples conquered and forgotten. Instead, they rebuilt, they adapted, they survived, and in surviving they created something remarkable, a distinctly African civilization that would endure for another 1,000 years, long after Assyria had fallen. Long after Egypt's independence was lost to Persia, Greece, and Rome, long after the ancient world that had witnessed Kush's rise had transformed beyond recognition. The period following the loss of Egypt forced Kush to redefine itself. No longer able to claim the prestige and resources of the Egyptian throne, the Kushite rulers focused on consolidating and developing their African homeland. The capital remained at Napata for several generations, that sacred city beneath the flat-topped mountain of Gebel Barkal, which the Kushites believed was the birthplace of Amun himself. Here, in the shadow of that holy mountain, the kings of Kush built their pyramids, not the massive monuments of Giza, but steep-sided, sharp-angled structures that nonetheless proclaimed their continued adherence to pharaonic tradition and their claim to be the true heirs of ancient Egyptian civilization. But geography and geopolitics conspired to push Kush further south. Napata, while religiously significant, was dangerously close to Egypt and vulnerable to attack from the north. Egyptian pharaohs of the 26th dynasty, the Site rulers who had replaced the Kushite 25th dynasty, harbored ambitions to control Nubia and its wealth. Around 593 BCE, Pharaoh Psamtik II launched a devastating raid into Nubia, pushing as far south as Napata itself. Though the Kushites repelled the invasion, the vulnerability of their capital was clear. In response, sometime in the 6th century BCE, the Kushite court began shifting southward, relocating the administrative and political center of the kingdom to Meroe, a city located between the 5th and 6th cataracts, much farther from the Egyptian threat and closer to the African heartland that would become Kush's true source of strength. The move to Meroe marked not just a geographical shift, but a cultural transformation. While the Napatan period had been characterized by intense engagement with Egyptian culture and traditions, the Meroitic period saw Kush develop a more distinctly African identity. This was not a rejection of the Egyptian heritage they had so thoroughly adopted. They continued to build pyramids, worship Egyptian-style gods, and use Egyptian royal iconography, but rather a synthesis, a blending of Egyptian forms with indigenous African traditions to create something new and unique. The Kingdom of Meroe, as it came to be known, was positioned to exploit new sources of wealth and power. While Napata had relied heavily on trade with Egypt and control of the Nile corridor, Meroe was situated in a region with significant iron ore deposits and access to trade routes leading deep into sub-Saharan Africa. iron technology, which had spread across the ancient world during the preceding centuries, was embraced enthusiastically by the Meroites. Archaeological excavations at Meroe have revealed extensive evidence of iron production, with massive slag heaps testifying to the scale of metallurgical activity. Some scholars have called Meroe the Birmingham of Africa, a center of iron production that supplied weapons, tools, and trade goods across a vast region. This mastery of iron technology gave Meroe significant military and economic advantages, allowing it to defend itself against enemies and project power across northeastern Africa. Meroe's location also gave it access to valuable trade goods from the African interior. Gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animal skins flowed through Meroitic markets. The kingdom controlled trade routes, linking the Nile Valley to the Red Sea, connecting the Mediterranean world with the Arabian Peninsula and ultimately with India and the trade networks of the Indian Ocean. Greek and Roman sources from later periods describe Meroe as a wealthy kingdom, a land of abundance and prosperity. The city itself grew into a major urban center, with palaces, temples, and public buildings sprawling across the east bank of the Nile. The Great Enclosure, a massive religious complex at the heart of Meroe, contained temples to both Egyptian gods like Amun and Isis and indigenous Kushite deities, reflecting the syncretic nature of Meroitic religion. Perhaps the most distinctly Meroitic development was the creation of their own writing system. While earlier Kushite rulers had used Egyptian hieroglyphs for monumental inscriptions, the Meroites developed their own script, now called Meroitic, which appeared in two forms: a hieroglyphic version for monumental and religious texts and a cursive form for everyday writing. Meroitic script, which emerged around the 3rd century BCE, represented a bold assertion of cultural independence. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs, which formed a largely logographic system with some phonetic elements, Meroitic was essentially an alphabet, with symbols representing sounds rather than concepts. The script was used extensively, appearing on temple walls, royal stelae, funerary monuments, and everyday objects. Hundreds of Meroitic texts have survived, offering tantalizing glimpses into the kingdom's history, culture, and language. Yet here lies one of history's great frustrations. While Meroitic script was deciphered in the early 20th century, we know the phonetic values of the symbols and can pronounce the words. The Meroitic language itself remains largely unknown. It appears to be unrelated to Egyptian, to Nubian languages, or to any other known language family. Without a bilingual text like the Rosetta Stone that unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphs, and with no living speakers to provide clues, Meroitic remains a mystery. We can read the words, but not understand their meaning. The voices of the Meroites speak to us across millennia in a language we cannot comprehend, their history and literature locked behind a linguistic barrier we have yet to breach. This linguistic isolation has contributed to Meroe's obscurity, making it impossible to access Meroitic historical records directly and leaving us dependent on often biased foreign sources and mute archaeological evidence. The political structure of Meroitic Kush was sophisticated and, in at least one respect, remarkably progressive for its time. Like earlier Kushite kingdoms, Meroe was ruled by a king, called the Kore, who held both political and religious authority. But Meroitic society also accorded extraordinary power to women, particularly to the Queen Mother, known as the Kandake or Candace. The Kandake was not merely a ceremonial figure, but held real political authority, often ruling alongside her son or even independently. Some Kandakes commanded armies in battle, appeared on monuments in royal regalia, and were buried with the full honors of independent rulers. This tradition of powerful female rulers had deep roots in Kushite culture, stretching back to the 25th dynasty when queen mothers had exercised significant influence. But in Meroe, it reached its fullest expression, with several Kandaks serving as de facto rulers of the kingdom. One of the most famous Kandaks was Amanirenas, who ruled Meroe in the late 1st century BCE, a period when Kush came into conflict with a new imperial power, Rome. By this time, Egypt had been conquered by Rome, becoming a province of the expanding Roman Empire after the death of Cleopatra VII in 30 BCE. The Romans, like the Egyptians and Persians before them, looked southward toward Nubia with acquisitive eyes, seeing in Kush both a potential threat and a source of wealth. Tensions between Rome and Meroe escalated quickly. The Roman prefect of Egypt, Gaius Petronius, pushed into Kushite territory, seizing the border region around the First Cataract. Kush's response was swift and devastating. Kandake Amanirenas led a Meroitic army north in 25 BCE, attacking Roman garrisons and pushing into Roman-controlled Upper Egypt. Her forces captured several Roman forts, took prisoners, and famously seized bronze statues of Emperor Augustus from Roman installations, carrying them back to Meroe as trophies of victory. The Roman response was predictable. Petronius marched south with a well-equipped Roman army, retaking the lost territory and pushing deep into Kush. Roman legions besieged and captured the Kushite city of Napata, still religiously significant, even though no longer the political capital. Roman sources describe the campaign as a complete victory, with Petronius claiming to have defeated the Kushites decisively, but the reality was more complex. The war dragged on for several years, with neither side able to achieve total victory. Roman supply lines stretched dangerously far from Egypt. The harsh Nubian climate and terrain challenged even Rome's disciplined legions, and the Kushites, fighting on their home territory, proved resilient and determined opponents. Kandake Amanirenas and her forces conducted guerrilla operations, harassing Roman positions and making occupation of Kushite territory costly and difficult. Eventually, both sides recognized that continued conflict served neither's interests. In 20 BCE, diplomatic negotiations resulted in a peace treaty, the Treaty of Samos, brokered by Emperor Augustus himself. The terms were remarkably favorable to Kush. The Romans withdrew from most of the territory they had occupied. The border was fixed at the First Cataract, roughly where it had been before the conflict began. Most remarkably, Augustus waived the tribute that Petronius had initially demanded, effectively acknowledging Kush's strength and independence. The Roman historian Strabo, writing about this period, speaks of the Kushites with respect, noting their courage and military prowess. The head of the Augustus statue that Amanirenas' forces had captured was buried beneath the entrance to a Meroitic temple, where visitors would symbolically trample the Roman emperor underfoot, a gesture of defiance and pride that remained hidden for centuries until archaeologists excavated it in the 20th century. The treaty with Rome ushered in several centuries of relative peace and prosperity for Meroe. While never again achieving the imperial extent of the 25th dynasty, Meroitic Kush maintained its independence and continued to thrive as a major regional power. Trade flourished, with Meroitic goods appearing in archaeological sites across northeastern Africa and even beyond. The kingdom maintained diplomatic and commercial relations with the Roman Empire, with Meroitic envoys traveling to Roman Egypt and Roman traders venturing into Kushite territory. Greek and Roman writers continued to describe Meroe with fascination, often repeating fantastical stories about Ethiopian kingdoms and warrior queens, mixing genuine information with legend and hearsay. Meroitic art and architecture during these centuries reflected the kingdom's prosperity and confidence. The royal pyramids at Meroe, where the kings and kandaks were buried, numbered over 200, creating a necropolis that, while less famous than those of Egypt, was nonetheless a monument to Kushite persistence and cultural continuity. These pyramids were smaller and steeper than their Egyptian counterparts, with distinctive chapel structures attached to their eastern faces where offerings could be made to the deceased rulers. Inside the chapels, walls were covered with reliefs and inscriptions showing the rulers in traditional pharaonic poses, receiving offerings from gods, smiting enemies, and performing religious rituals, images that spanned the centuries from Kush's origins to its final days, testifying to an unbroken cultural tradition that lasted longer than most civilizations exist at all. Meroitic temples combined Egyptian, Hellenistic, and indigenous African elements into a distinctive architectural style. The Temple of Apidimak at Musawwara Tesufra, dedicated to a lion-headed warrior god unique to Kushite religion, features reliefs showing rulers and deities in a style that blends Egyptian formality with more naturalistic African features. The Temple of Amun at Meroe maintained the traditional Egyptian temple layout, but incorporated decorative elements and architectural details that were distinctly Meroitic. These temples were not mere imitations of Egyptian models, but creative adaptations that reflected Meroe's unique cultural synthesis. Religion in Meroe was similarly syncretic. The traditional Egyptian gods remained important, particularly Amun, Isis, and Osiris, but they were worshipped alongside indigenous African deities. Apidimak, the lion god associated with warfare and protection, became increasingly prominent in Meroitic religion, appearing on temples and royal monuments throughout the kingdom. Other gods with no Egyptian parallels appear in Meroitic inscriptions and iconography, suggesting a rich religious tradition that combined elements from multiple sources. This religious synthesis mirrored the broader cultural pattern of Meroitic civilization. It was neither purely Egyptian nor purely African, but something new, a unique cultural formation that drew on multiple traditions to create an identity distinctly its own. Economic life in Meroe was diverse and sophisticated. Agriculture remained fundamental, with the Nile's annual floods providing water for crops along the river valley. Sorghum, millet, and other drought-resistant grains were cultivated, supplementing wheat and barley in regions where rainfall was sufficient. Cattle were raised extensively, as they had been throughout Kushite history, providing not only food, but also wealth, status, and religious significance. Iron production, as noted earlier, was a major industry, with Meroe's smiths producing weapons, tools, and trade goods that were distributed widely. Gold mining continued in the Nubian Desert, though perhaps not on the same scale as during earlier periods when Egyptian demand had driven intensive exploitation of the gold fields. Trade networks extended in all directions from Meroe. To the north, trade with Roman Egypt brought Mediterranean goods, wine, olive oil, fine pottery into Kushite markets in exchange for African products. To the east, routes led to Red Sea ports, connecting Meroe with the Arabian Peninsula and the wider Indian Ocean trade network that was flourishing during the Roman period. To the south and west, trade penetrated deep into sub-Saharan Africa, bringing ivory, exotic woods, and enslaved people from the interior. These trade networks made Meroe a cosmopolitan center where people, goods, and ideas from different regions mixed and interacted. Archaeological evidence suggests that people from various backgrounds lived in Meroe, creating a diverse urban population quite unlike the more ethnically homogeneous societies of many ancient kingdoms. Yet despite its sophistication and longevity, the Kingdom of Meroe was not immune to the forces of change and decline that eventually overtake all civilizations. The exact causes of Meroe's fall remain debated by scholars, a puzzle made more difficult by the lack of detailed written sources for the kingdom's later centuries. What is clear is that by the 3rd century CE, Meroitic power was waning. The archaeological record shows declining prosperity, with fewer monumental building projects, reduced evidence of trade, and signs of depopulation in some regions. The reasons for this decline were likely multiple and interconnected, a combination of environmental, economic, political, and military factors that gradually eroded the foundations of Meroitic power. Climate change may have played a role. The Sahara had been gradually becoming drier over millennia, and fluctuations in rainfall could have affected agriculture and grazing lands that supported Meroe's economy. Overgrazing and deforestation, possibly related to the demands of iron production, which required substantial amounts of charcoal, may have degraded the local environment around Meroe itself, reducing the carrying capacity of the land. Trade patterns were shifting as well. The rise of the Aksumite kingdom in what is now Ethiopia created a rival power that controlled trade routes between the African interior and the Red Sea, potentially diverting commerce away from Meroitic ports and markets. Internal political instability may have weakened the kingdom, though our lack of detailed sources makes this impossible to confirm definitively. The death blow came from Aksum. The Aksumite kingdom, centered in the Ethiopian highlands, had been growing in power throughout the early centuries of the Common Era. Aksumite rulers controlled important Red Sea ports and had developed a prosperous trade-based economy. They had also adopted Christianity in the 4th century CE, aligning themselves religiously with the Roman Empire, now centered in Constantinople. Around 350 CE, the Aksumite king Ezana launched a military campaign against Meroe. Aksumite inscriptions, written in Ge'ez and containing some of the few contemporary references to Meroe's final period, describe this campaign in terms of punishing the Kushites for their raids and establishing Aksumite dominance over the region. Ezana's forces apparently conquered Meroe itself, bringing an end to the kingdom that had endured for over 1,000 years. The fall of Meroe did not mean the immediate disappearance of Kushite culture or people. Populations continued to live in the region, and cultural traditions persisted even as political authority fragmented. In the wake of Meroe's collapse, several smaller kingdoms emerged in Nubia, the most important being the X-group culture, also called the Balana culture, after the site where its characteristic royal tombs were first discovered. These post-Meroitic kingdoms maintained some cultural continuity with their Meroitic predecessors, while also showing increasing influence from the north as Christianity gradually spread up the Nile Valley. By the 6th century CE, Christianity had firmly established itself in Nubia, with the conversion of local kingdoms creating what scholars call the Christian Nubian kingdoms, Nobatia, Makuria, and Alodia. These kingdoms maintained independence for centuries, surviving even after Islamic armies conquered Egypt in the 7th century. Christian Nubia became a buffer zone between Islamic North Africa and pagan and later Christian Ethiopia, a region where African Christian traditions developed in relative isolation from European Christianity. The Christian Nubian kingdoms left behind remarkable monuments, including rock-cut churches decorated with beautiful frescoes showing distinctly African saints and biblical figures, testament to a Christian African civilization that thrived for centuries before finally being absorbed into the Islamic world during the late medieval period. But the memory of Kush itself, of the empire that had once ruled Egypt and dominated northeastern Africa, faded into obscurity. The Meroitic script could no longer be read. The pyramids and temples of Napata and Meroe stood silent in the desert, visited occasionally by travelers, but with their history forgotten or garbled beyond recognition. Greek and Roman writers had left scattered references to Kush, but these were often confused, mixing fact with fancy, real history with mythical embellishment. In the medieval Islamic world, some awareness of ancient Nubian kingdoms persisted, but the specific knowledge of Kush's greatness, of the 25th dynasty that ruled Egypt, of the centuries of Meroitic civilization, was lost. The modern rediscovery of Kush began in the 19th century, part of the broader European fascination with ancient Egypt and the Near East that characterized the imperial age. Early European travelers and archaeologists working in Egypt and Sudan encountered the ruins of Kushite monuments, the pyramids at Napata and Meroe, the temples of Gebel Barkal, the fortresses of the Middle Nile. But these discoveries were often interpreted through the lens of racist assumptions about African capabilities. European scholars, products of their time and culture, found it difficult to accept that black African peoples had created such sophisticated civilizations. Some attributed Kushite achievements to Egyptian influence, arguing that Kush was merely a pale imitation of Egyptian culture with no originality or significance of its own. Others suggested that Kush's rulers were not truly African, but rather people of Mediterranean origin who had migrated south. Still others simply ignored Kush altogether, focusing their attention and resources on excavating Egyptian sites while the monuments of Kush crumbled in neglect. The decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs in the 19th century, following the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, made it possible to read Egyptian texts that mentioned Kush and the 25th dynasty. Egyptologists gradually pieced together the history of the Kushite pharaohs from Egyptian sources, but even then, the tendency was to minimize Kushite achievements and emphasize Egyptian dominance. The 25th dynasty was characterized as a period of Egyptian decline, a foreign occupation by less civilized southerners. The fact that the Kushites had been expelled from Egypt by the Assyrians was highlighted, while their achievements in unifying Egypt and promoting Egyptian cultural traditions was downplayed. In the grand narrative of Western civilization that was being constructed during this period, a narrative that traced a direct line from ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia through Greece and Rome to modern Europe, Kush had no place. It was African, it was black, and therefore, in the racist logic of the time, it could not be truly civilized or significant. This marginalization of Kush in historical scholarship has had lasting effects. Even today, when most historians and archaeologists have rejected the racist assumptions of earlier generations, Kush remains relatively obscure. The average person with some knowledge of ancient history can likely name famous Egyptian pharaohs like Ramesses II, Tutankhamun, or Cleopatra. They may know something of ancient Mesopotamian civilizations or classical Greece and Rome, but ask about Kush, about Pa or Taharqa, about Meroe or Napata, and most will draw a blank. Kush is absent from most standard world history textbooks, or at best receives a brief mention. Museum exhibits focus overwhelmingly on Egypt, while ignoring or minimizing its southern neighbor. Popular culture, which has done so much to keep ancient Egypt in public consciousness through countless films, novels, and documentaries, has largely ignored Kush. The result is a massive gap in popular historical knowledge, an entire civilization erased from the story we tell about humanity's past. Yet the truth about Kush cannot remain buried forever. Archaeological work in Sudan, though often hampered by political instability and limited funding, has continued to reveal the extent and sophistication of Kushite civilization. Excavations at Meroe, Napata, Kerma, and other sites have uncovered palaces, temples, workshops, and tombs that testify to a complex, prosperous, and culturally advanced society. The hundreds of pyramids scattered across the Nubian Desert, while less famous than Egypt's, are nonetheless remarkable monuments that demonstrate continuity of tradition over more than 1,000 years. The Victory Stela of Pa, that extraordinary document describing his conquest of Egypt, reveals a ruler as sophisticated and pious as any Egyptian pharaoh. The evidence is overwhelming. Kush was not a peripheral backwater, but a major ancient civilization, one that deserves to be studied, taught, and remembered alongside better-known ancient societies. The significance of Kush extends beyond its own achievements, important as those were. Kush challenges fundamental assumptions about the development of complex civilizations and the capabilities of African peoples. It demonstrates that sub-Saharan Africa was not, as racist pseudo-history has long claimed, a continent without history or civilization before European contact. Kush was developing sophisticated political institutions, monumental architecture, writing systems, and international trade networks, while many parts of the world, including much of Europe, remained organized in much simpler ways. The Kushite pharaohs ruled Egypt at a time when Rome was a small city-state and Athens had not yet reached its classical flowering. Meroitic civilization endured for centuries after the Western Roman Empire fell. Kush's history demolishes the racist myth that African peoples were somehow less capable of creating complex civilizations than peoples elsewhere. Moreover, Kush's story complicates simplistic narratives about ancient Egypt itself. Egypt is often claimed as part of Western civilization, a cultural ancestor of Europe despite being geographically African. This appropriation depends partly on minimizing Egypt's African connections and emphasizing its Mediterranean links. But Kush, whose rulers conquered and controlled Egypt for nearly a century, whose culture was deeply intertwined with Egyptian culture, whose people worshipped Egyptian gods and built Egyptian-style monuments, make such appropriation impossible to sustain. If Egypt belongs to the narrative of Western civilization, then so too must Kush. But Kush was undeniably African, undeniably black, rooted in the Nubian heartland, and connected to the cultures of sub-Saharan Africa. The only way to exclude Kush from the story is to exclude Egypt as well, or to acknowledge that Western civilization, as commonly taught, is a selective and distorted narrative that ignores or marginalizes African achievements. The erasure of Kush from historical memory is not merely an academic issue. It has real consequences for how we understand human history, for how African peoples see themselves and are seen by others, and for the narratives we construct about civilization and progress. When we teach history as if complex civilizations only emerged in the Mediterranean and Near East, as if Africa's contributions were minimal or derivative, we perpetuate harmful stereotypes and rob African peoples of their legitimate heritage. Young people of African descent grow up learning about the achievements of ancient Greece and Rome, of China and India, but rarely about the great kingdoms and empires that flourished in Africa. They are taught, implicitly or explicitly, that their ancestors built nothing of significance, that African history begins with colonialism and slavery. This is not merely false, but actively harmful, damaging to identity and self-understanding. Reclaiming Kush, telling its story fully and accurately, is thus an act of historical justice. It means acknowledging that Africa has a deep and rich history of complex civilizations that existed long before European contact. It means recognizing that African peoples developed sophisticated political systems, artistic traditions, architectural styles, religious philosophies, and technological innovations independently and in interaction with other cultures. It means understanding that the kingdoms of Kush were every bit as legitimate, as complex, as worthy of study as any other ancient civilization. And it means challenging the Eurocentric historical narratives that have dominated scholarship and education for too long, replacing them with more accurate and inclusive accounts that give all peoples and regions their proper place in human history. The story of Kush also offers important lessons about cultural adaptation and synthesis. The Kushites did not simply copy Egyptian civilization slavishly, nor did they completely reject it in favor of maintaining some imagined pure African culture. Instead, they absorbed what was useful, adapted it to their own needs and circumstances, and combined it with indigenous traditions to create something new and unique. This pattern of cultural synthesis is common throughout human history. No civilization develops in isolation, and all borrow, adapt, and transform ideas from their neighbors. But Kush's example is particularly striking because it challenges the notion that cultural borrowing equals cultural inferiority. The fact that Kush learned from Egypt and adopted many Egyptian practices did not make Kush merely derivative. It made Kush sophisticated, adaptable, and capable of leveraging the knowledge and traditions of others to build its own distinctive civilization. Kush's long survival is also noteworthy. From the earliest Kerma culture around 2500 BCE to the fall of Meroe around 350 CE, Kushite civilization in its various forms endured for nearly 3 millennia. This longevity exceeded that of most ancient civilizations. It spanned the entire history of ancient Egypt, from the Old Kingdom to the Roman conquest and beyond. It saw the rise and fall of Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and numerous other empires. It outlasted classical Greece and the Western Roman Empire. Few civilizations in human history have demonstrated such resilience and staying power. This longevity suggests that Kushite civilization, far from being marginal or fragile, was deeply rooted, well adapted to its environment, and capable of weathering the storms of political upheaval and military conflict that destroyed so many other ancient states. The mystery of the Meroitic language adds a poignant dimension to Kush's story. Here was a civilization sophisticated enough to develop its own writing system, to produce extensive written records, to document its history and beliefs in its own words. Yet that voice is now largely silent, the language unreadable despite our ability to sound out the words. It is as if the Kushites are speaking to us across the centuries, but we cannot understand what they are saying. This linguistic silence has contributed to Kush's obscurity. Without access to Meroitic texts, we are dependent on foreign sources that are often biased, incomplete, or inaccurate. The decipherment of Meroitic, if it can ever be achieved, would revolutionize our understanding of Kushite history and culture, finally allowing the Kushites to speak for themselves rather than being seen only through the eyes of Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, and modern scholars. Yet even without understanding the Meroitic language, the physical evidence speaks volumes. The pyramids of Meroe and Napata, though weathered by time and sadly vandalized by 19th-century treasure hunters who destroyed many of them in search of gold, still stand as testament to Kushite architectural achievement and cultural continuity. The temples, with their massive stone columns and walls covered in reliefs, demonstrate sophisticated engineering and artistic skill. The artifacts recovered from royal tombs, jewelry, weapons, pottery, amulets reveal craftsmanship of high quality and distinctive style. The iron slag heaps at Meroe testify to industrial production on a scale that few ancient civilizations achieved. The agricultural remains, the evidence of long-distance trade, the layout of cities and settlements, all these material traces allow archaeologists to reconstruct a picture of a complex, prosperous, and sophisticated civilization even without being able to read its texts. The Kandakes of Meroe deserve special mention as remarkable figures whose existence challenges modern assumptions about gender roles in ancient societies. These were not merely ceremonial queens or consorts, but rulers in their own right, women who commanded armies, built monuments, and governed a kingdom. The famous relief of Kandake Amanirenas at Meroe shows her as a powerful, larger-than-life figure, depicted with the traditional attributes of pharaonic authority, but clearly female. Roman sources describe her role in the conflict with Rome, acknowledging her as a formidable opponent. Other Kandaks are known from inscriptions and monuments, each one a testament to women's power in Kushite society. This tradition of powerful female rulers had few parallels in the ancient world and stands in stark contrast to the patriarchal norms that dominated most ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern civilizations. Modern Sudan, the nation-state that now encompasses most of the territory of ancient Kush, has a complex relationship with this heritage. Decades of civil war, political instability, and economic challenges have made archaeological research difficult and left many ancient sites vulnerable to looting and neglect. The construction of modern dams on the Nile, necessary for development but devastating to archaeological sites, has submerged parts of ancient Nubia, creating an urgent need for rescue archaeology to document sites before they are lost forever. International teams have worked alongside Sudanese archaeologists to excavate and preserve what they can, but resources are limited and the challenge is immense. There is also the question of how modern Sudanese society relates to ancient Kushite heritage. Sudan is now predominantly Arab and Muslim, with many modern Sudanese identifying more with Arab culture and Islamic history than with the pre-Islamic civilizations of the Nile Valley. Yet there are also efforts to reclaim and celebrate Kushite heritage as a source of national pride, to recognize the pyramids and temples of Nubia as rightfully belonging to Sudan's history and identity rather than being seen as mere extensions of Egyptian civilization. The broader question of how we remember and honor ancient African civilizations like Kush is increasingly urgent. As movements to decolonize education and challenge Eurocentric historical narratives gain momentum, There is growing recognition that the standard historical accounts taught in schools and universities around the world are incomplete and distorted. African history is often reduced to the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism, as if nothing of significance happened in Africa before European contact. Ancient African civilizations, when mentioned at all, are often portrayed as derivative or less impressive than their Mediterranean counterparts. This distortion is not merely an oversight, but reflects centuries of racist ideology that portrayed Africans as inherently inferior and Africa as a continent without history. Correcting this distortion requires not just adding a few paragraphs about Kush to textbooks, but fundamentally rethinking how we teach world history, ensuring that African civilizations receive the same attention, respect, and nuanced treatment as civilizations in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. For the African diaspora, particularly African Americans and other peoples whose ancestors were forcibly removed from Africa through the slave trade, the history of Kush has special resonance. Here is proof, if any were needed, that African peoples built great civilizations, created sophisticated cultures, and played central roles in the ancient world. The Kushite pharaohs ruled Egypt, one of humanity's oldest and most celebrated civilizations. They built pyramids that still stand after thousands of years. They developed writing systems, mastered complex technologies, and created art of remarkable beauty. They fought Rome to a standstill and maintained their independence for 1,000 years. This history contradicts every racist claim about African inferiority, every attempt to justify slavery and colonialism by portraying Africans as primitive or backward. Reclaiming Kush is thus part of a broader project of reclaiming African history, of recognizing the full humanity and achievements of African peoples, and of building historical narratives that reflect the truth, rather than serving the interests of those who sought to dominate and exploit Africa. The Kingdom of Kush may be forgotten by most, erased from the historical narratives taught in schools and depicted in popular culture, but it cannot remain forgotten forever. The pyramids still stand in the Nubian Desert, silent witnesses to vanished glory. The temples still bear inscriptions in hieroglyphs and Meroitic script, waiting for those who will take the time to read and understand them. The tombs still yield artifacts that speak of wealth, sophistication, and artistry. The historical record, fragmentary as it is, still contains enough information to reconstruct the broad outlines of Kushite history. And increasingly, scholars, educators, and activists are working to bring Kush's story to wider audiences, to ensure that this remarkable civilization receives the recognition it deserves. In the end, the story of Kush is a story of resilience and persistence. It is the story of a people who survived conquest and domination, who adapted and thrived, who created a distinctive civilization that endured for millennia. It is the story of pharaohs who conquered Egypt and ruled with wisdom and piety, of kandaks who led armies and governed kingdoms, of craftsmen who worked iron and gold into objects of utility and beauty, of scribes who created a unique writing system to record their language and culture, of builders who raised pyramids and temples that have outlasted empires. It is a story that challenges comfortable narratives about civilization and progress, that forces us to confront the biases and blind spots in how we understand the past. It is a story that belongs not just to Sudan or to Africa, but to all of humanity, part of the shared heritage of our species. The Kingdom of Kush may be forgotten, but it should not remain so. Its pyramids deserve to be as famous as those of Giza. Its rulers deserve to be as well known as any Egyptian pharaoh. Its achievements deserve to be taught in every world history course, discussed in every survey of ancient civilizations, and celebrated as part of humanity's collective accomplishment. To remember Kush is to remember that Africa has always been part of world history, that African peoples have always been builders and creators, that the story of human civilization is incomplete without Africa's chapters fully included. The lost Kingdom of Kush was never truly lost. It has been here all along, waiting in the desert sands, waiting for us to open our eyes and truly see.